If you like knight, samurai, romance, weapons and armor, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Today we're talking about protection for the throat. Welcome back. Okay, so as you know, on this channel we often talk about both weapons and armor, and today is one of those videos where we focus more on protection. And armor has got loads of different components and loads of different parts, and today we're going to discuss about this section here, this mail collar, which actually has a specific name, a historical name. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's one of the possible configurations, both in the late 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, of protection for your throat. Now for this explanation I'm just wearing my breastplate because I wanted to show you how the breastplate interacts with the collar, with the protection here, and then I'll be wearing a couple of different kinds of medieval helmets to show you how they interact with it. But generally speaking, the breastplate's function is of course to protect the center of mass in this case, and it's protecting my heart, it's protecting my lungs, and generally speaking my rib cage. The lower part in the 14th century, my abdomen would be protected by mail, and in the 15th century instead I would have a placard, which would be another layer of plate protecting me here. So today's topic obviously is the mail collar. This in the 14th century would have been called a pisan. In the 15th century it's called a standard, although there is a slight difference in shape, and I'll get to that in a minute. But generally speaking, it's this collar of rings that it's put here to protect my throat. But what I wanted to show you is that, and the reason why I'm wearing a breastplate now is because even before discussing the actual protection that I've got here, that it's supposed to prevent a blade to cut my throat or puncture or thrust my throat, the breastplate itself is actually the first line of defense for my throat, and then the mail standard or pisan. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that my opponent has got a sword and is trying to thrust me. As the thrust comes towards my breastplate and it hits the breastplate, generally speaking center of mass, one of the first things that are going to happen, of course this is not going to go through the breastplate, so the weapon is going to glance. And as that happens, hopefully it will be intercepted by the stop rib. What the stop rib is doing here is granting protection to my throat, because imagine if this wasn't here and the blade was able to freely skid up, it would end up in my throat. And of course if that happens, which it can still happen regardless of the stop rib, but if that happens, then hopefully the mail standard or the mail pisan will provide enough protection, and we'll talk a bit about how this one works exactly. But generally speaking, the stop rib is my first line of defense for my throat that will prevent the weapon to be redirected into my throat. And as the weapon goes up, even if it cuts on the sides, then I've got mail riveted rings that are going to protect me from this. But let's say that I'm an unlucky knight and the stop rib failed for some reason. Maybe the hit actually hit, someone thrust me here, and therefore I didn't have a stop rib anymore. And there is only this little part here which could prevent the blade to reach the throat. But let's say that that doesn't happen, it doesn't work, and the blade is now directed to my throat. Well, this is obviously a 4-in-1, 4 solid rings and 1 riveted ring pattern. It's very stout. The one thing we have to say is that it also has a layer underneath. Now on the top you see leather, and we'll talk about the authenticity of this in a moment, but on the top we've got leather, and underneath, now on this other specimen here, we still have a basis of leather here to provide us a certain amount of padding and also comfort, so that the rings are not directly chafing, rubbing against my throat. But the one I'm actually wearing has got a double layer of linen inside, so that again it provides padding, so it works in conjunction with the mail to provide both shock absorption, penetration resistance, and of course cut resistance. With that, the rings already do. It's also very comfortable to wear. In fact, I find the linen to be even more comfortable than the leather alone. Having said that, let's have a look how it interacts with helmets. So the first helmet I'm going to try it with is this Kettle Hat. This is a late 15th century Kettle Hat Italian style, so it is slightly anachronistic with this breastplate. I would be wearing something a bit more, because this is a late 14th century breastplate, but please excuse this anachronism for a moment. My 15th century cuirass, it's still being produced. But let's have a look how it interacts with this, because a helmet this style could have absolutely been used with a collar like this. Okay, so with the Kettle Hat, I have to say, I think it works very well. And sometimes in the 15th century, you will have versions of this that will actually cover you all the way up here. And sometimes they will be used with sallets as well. But this already, I like it because it gives me complete mobility. The Kettle Hat is protecting the skull, the most important part of my head, but my face is able to breathe, I'm able to see, I'm able to speak, and I'm able to hear. Now, obviously, I don't have a lot of protection in my face, and if I do want more protection, I will need a different kind of helmet, and we're going to try one that is more protective in a second. But already this configuration, I'm used to wearing my Kettle Hat, but I have to say that wearing my Kettle Hat without anything for my throat kind of makes me feel unprotected, and with this I already feel a big difference. The next helmet of the day is going to be my Italian barbute. So let's have a look how this one works. Although to wear this one, since it goes all the way down, I need to untie my hair because otherwise my ponytail is not going to help. I'm such a poser. Okay, so how does it interact with this barbute? Well, I have to say that it actually interacts better than I had expected, because as you can see, it's a more close-fitting helmet, and it provides me more protection, of course. The two pieces don't interfere. I feel protected because I've got, again, the stop rib, I've got my breastplate, I've got the mail here, and then directly there is some certain level of overlap here with the frontal plates of my barbute, and in a way I think it really does help. It adds up, so that if someone tries to grasp me from the back and tries to slit my throat, well, they can't. Now, obviously, if you want even more protection, there will be other helmets, for example, the sallets, that will provide more protection for you. But personally, I love this combination of the mail collar, the breastplate, and the barbute. And of course, here I would have my shoulder plates and the rest of the armor. So this is how the mail collar works, and of course this was not the only option for a knight, because you see, as we go back in time and we look at the times of the Normans, for example, the Norman period, then the protection of the throat was actually integral part of the mail hauberk. So you had a mail shirt, which is longer, that's why it's called a hauberk, and it would have a coif integrated into the mail, so that as you put it on, then it would also provide protection for the throat. But as we reach the 13th century, then the coif becomes a separate piece, and the mail shirt instead, it's cut wide open here so that it's easier to put on. But as we reach the end of the 13th century and then the 14th century, the separate collar can be worn now, so that you don't actually have to wear the full coif, which we don't really need anymore, because helmets are now becoming more and more effective, and they don't need the entirety of the head being covered in mail. And this will be one of the options for you to choose from. And of course, if you have got a bassinet, as we reach the late 14th century, then you know that many bassinets had an attached aventail, which is again another style. There are lots of different options for a knight, particularly in the 14th century. And as we go through the 14th century and 15th century, plate collars, protection for the throat will start to be implemented. But the mail protection underneath is never really going away as an option, and that's because it provides a lot of mobility for your head in combat, so it's quite adequate. And of course, as we reach very complex helmets such as the Armour, then it does become somewhat redundant, but some knights could still choose to wear it underneath anyways. So the mail collar was in use for a very long period of time, and sometimes we see it used together even when early versions of plate protection were available. Some soldiers actually preferred the mail collar until the plate protection becomes so sophisticated that it completely surpasses the concept of mail as a protection for the throat. But we'll have to get to the late 15th century and early 16th century to get to that point. Okay, so what about this part here on the top? So this is coherent with iconography and art, so we know that this was the case, it was used, but we can't really be 100% sure that it was made of leather. In fact, I imagine that it could have been fabric itself, we don't know. And mine is in leather. It's absolutely fine to have it made in leather, but as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but if we look at iconography, we don't really know what these were made of. I couldn't see definitive proof for these to be absolutely made of leather. Again, I could be wrong, but it's interesting when you look at iconography that the color also doesn't help, because if this was leather, then why is it blue in this image? So I'm just saying, I'd like to keep an open mind towards what material this could have been. Maybe it was leather, maybe it was fabric, maybe it was linen, maybe you had both as options, because again, oftentimes we do have options. When we look at brigandines, for example, sometimes they were velvet, sometimes it wasn't. You have lots of different options as well, and therefore I would imagine that for this as well there would have been several options. But the idea of making it leather, it's coherent, it's fine. The very top might have been made of a different material, which we don't know, and also it's not always present. So you can have male standards that don't have this, but I have to say that having it makes it stylish and quite comfortable. Now, there are of course a few possible configurations, and as I was saying, there is a difference between a pisan and a male standard. Generally speaking, the male standard has a more geometrical shape, whereas a pisan tends to be more round, but they do work the same way. And also you've got different possible configurations in terms of the size of the rings. In this case, the one I'm wearing has got relatively large rings, but this one here, as you will appreciate, has a very, very small mesh, which should provide better protection. And I'd like to thank my friend Gabriel from France for making these for me. Now let's talk about other details. Was it worn underneath the breastplate like I'm doing here, or could it be worn over the breastplate? Well, we see both. So personally, I find this configuration with the male tuck underneath the breastplate not only more effective, but also more elegant. The reason why I say more effective is because if the male was hanging over here and a blade was sliding up, there is a chance, there could be a chance of the blade going underneath it and then catch up and thrust me in the throat. This is a problem that you can get when you wear a male aventail, for example. So whenever I'm wearing a male standard or a pisan, I like wearing it underneath the breastplate, because this way I feel more protected, and besides, I also think it makes it more elegant. To conclude, I'd like to mention again the protection in plate, which eventually I will have. As you know, I'm having a full 15th century Milanese style plate harness. It's being produced, and it will soon, I hope, get here. It should be completed in February, and so then, postal, and then it will have to be posted to me. But as soon as it gets here, I will make a comparison video between a 14th century knight and a 15th century knight. But I have to say that my favorite would be a plate protector, but we have to get to the 15th century, because if we look at the very first sort of great bassinets, for example, that replaced the male aventail with a sort of collar of plate, well, those I don't particularly like them. I don't like them aesthetically. I don't find them pleasing aesthetically, and I feel that they would be, I don't know, quite stiff. So if I wear a 14th century knight, a late 14th century knight, probably I would be wearing a male collar. But as we get into the late 15th century, then I would definitely go for something that it would be articulated and at the same time more protective, or even something like a wrapper. Although I do realize that mostly wrappers were used in the joust, but still I would love to have an armet or with a wrapper. I think that that's the best configuration in terms of protection and mobility. And if you want more protection than that, you need to go to a frog mouth, which although it would have to be used entirely only during the joust, because a frog mouth completely removes your ability to move your head, but an armet with a wrapper is, I think, the best you can get in terms of protection, which still allows you a certain level of mobility as well, which of course is very important in combat. And here we are. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this brief video on the male standard, the male pisan, the male protection for the throat. What would you prefer? Would you go for a male collar? Would you go for an early 14th century plate protector? Is plate your favorite protection? Is male your favorite protection for the throat? Well, let me know in the comments below. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.